Chapter 3. The Assyrian, or First Great Empire. This is pre-Egyptian, so they were the greater empire. Nimrod, Semiramis, Sardanapalus. Have Nineveh of length within a wall, several days' journey, built by Ninus, old of that first golden monarchy, the seat. Milton. We have seen how God defeated the attempt to establish by worldly means an universal empire. That plan was postponed till the confusion of tongues was reminded by as signal a miracle as had occasioned it, until the time came for the establishment of the kingdom of God here below. Yet the final consummation was thus early provided for in the arrangements of society, and the order of man's public estate was made a framework which should minister to the purpose of the Most High. With this view, the theatre of this world was filled up by four great empires, which prepared the way for Christ's kingdom. Of these, the first was the Assyrian monarchy. Before it was ended, God revealed its fortunes in those of the three later ones to his prophet Daniel, and by this means we know that they were the temporal precursors of Christ. They were the temporal precursors of Christ's kingdom, and that they will not be followed by any other worldly monarchy of like importance, but of this hereafter. The first great empire was founded by Nimrod, and its original seat was at Babel, or Babylon. This we may suppose to have been about 2,200 years before our Lord's coming, and for 150 years after the flood. From Babylon he went out to the conquest of Ashur. Here it has Ashur, because the Greeks don't have the sh sound in their language, so why is it they've put Ashur? Okay, yeah, it should be A-S-H-U-R, but maybe sometimes they spell it with two S's. But yeah, Ashur, the land of the Ashurites, or the Assyrians, future Assyrians, a son of Shem, had builded Nineveh. Genesis 10:11. From the name of those they conquered, his followers were called Assyrians. Means lives were still so long that it is probable Nimrod was their leader for nearly 200 years, and he was worshipped by them after his death under the title of Belus, or Bel. The next prince of whom we read was Ninus, whom pagan historians suppose to have lived about 200 years before Christ. Under him Nineveh became that great city, Jonah 3:2, of which we are told that its walls were 3 days' journey in circuit. It was the capital of the east, which by this time was well peopled. Its more distant countries, India, Bactria, and Egypt, had been settled at the time of the birth of Peleg, Shem's great-grandson, and Peleg was lately dead, having lived 239 years, according to Genesis 10:25. Probably his lineage was that long, not his actual age and death, right? Ninus conquered Bactria, one of the first places in which the wealth of the world was concentrated, and in that early age the chief channel of communication with India. He was succeeded by his queen, Semiramis, to whom Babylon owed its earliest decorations. She was not more distinguished for her splendour than for her warlike enterprises, but she was defeated in an attempted invasion of India, chiefly by means of the elephants which abounded in that country, and which they used in war. To match them, Semiramis made figures to imitate the shape of an elephant. Every figure had a man to guide and a camel to carry it. But these mock elephants stood the shock of the real ones but a little while, for the Indian beasts, being exceedingly vast and stout, easily brought down all that opposed them. The odd 2:1. The queen, who had crossed the river Indus on a bridge of boats, could scarcely escape herself with about 1/3 of her men. From this time the river Indus was the boundary of this great empire toward the south, while it possessed such part of the rest of Asia as well as peopled, and in this state it lasted for about 1260 years. Of its transactions in the interval we know little or nothing, yet the long existence of this vast empire connects the first attempt of worldly ambition with those great events which God was afterwards about to exhibit among mankind. We see more clearly the several stages of the world's history. 4 vain attempts on the part of man at binding together all nations, and then the winding up of the mighty history in the kingdom of the Son of God. After the Assyrian Empire had existed in all about 1450 years, it was broken into 2 kingdoms, which lasted about 200 years longer. This took place at the death of Sardanapalus. His father Pul and the people of Nineveh had repented at Jonah's teachings. 5, and his footnote indication in the bottom. BC 747. Great uncertainty attaches to the chronology of this part of history. The date here given is that assigned in Prideaux's connection. The chronology commonly adopted in this work up to the time of our Lord, Jesus Christ, is that of Blair. Afterwards, that of Burton in his lectures on ecclesiastical history is generally followed. Okay, so Sardanapalus, says Father Paul, and the people of Nineveh had repented at Jonah's teaching, but the whole people soon sunk back into sensuality and sin. Sardanapalus himself exceeded all his predecessors in sloth and luxury, and led a most effeminate life, wallowing in pleasure and wanton dalliance. And it's according to Diod 2:2. 2 of his subjects are Bacchus, general of the Median soldiers, and Belessus, governor of Babylon, having found means to enter the palace where he had shut himself up among women and eunuchs, were so indignant at his degeneracy that they rebelled against him. Sardanapalus at first opposed them with great vigour, but the Medes, a more warlike people than the Assyrians, finally defeated his army and besieged him in Nineveh. Its fortifications, however, were so strong, and it was so well supplied with provisions that he might still have defied his enemies, had not a sudden inundation of the river Tigris destroyed a large portion of the city wall. When Sardanapalus saw that his kingdom was lost and Nineveh, his great city, taken, he caused a huge pile of wood to be made in his palace court, heaped upon it his gold, silver, and raw apparel, and gathered his wives and the corrupt courtiers who had shared his excesses into the midst. Then he set fire to the pile and burnt himself and them together. So miserable an end had a life of sin. Chapter 4, the call of Abraham. Great grace that old man had to him given. Great grace that old man to him given had, for God he often saw from heaven's heights. Spence. About the time when the first worldly empire came to its strength under Semiramis, it pleased God, with whom 1,000 years are as one day, to make gradual and silent preparation in another manner for that kingdom in which the nations of this world were finally to be united. This was done by the call of Abraham. Abraham was the chief of one of the eldest tribes of Shem's children, and though even among them the worship of idols had begun to appear, it's Joshua 24:2. Yet the God of Noah was remembered in this family, to Genesis 31:53, which had remained in Ur in Chaldea, near man's first dwelling place, and which probably had long been influenced by the neighbourhood of Noah himself. From this country now become the seat of the Babylonian Empire. Abraham was called to depart. BC 1921. The Lord had said unto him, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing, and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thy seed, with its descendants, shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Genesis 12:1-3. This promise is the great charter of the church. When Adam lost paradise, God had promised him that of the woman's seed should come a deliverer for the human race. Genesis 3:15. And now the hope was to gain shape and substance by being embodied in those lasting institutions which have their completion in the church. The promise makes mention first of an earthly inheritance, and then of a heavenly possession, first of a temporal seed, and then of a spiritual progeny, first of that which should be confined to one nation, and then of that in which all the world should be included. Yet were these several parts of the promise so united that the one was born, as it were, in the arms of the other. Before their completion they seemed but one, and since their completion they have been again so blended together that whatsoever was spoken of the outward has reference also to the inward blessing. For God's dispensations have been ever thus. What is present and temporal has taken its shape from some more lasting blessing which lay hid within. As the indistinct imaginations of childhood express the weakness of man's knowledge in this present state, 1 Corinthians 13:11-12. And as the ark was taken of the church, in which men are in like manner offered a refuge from destruction, 1 Peter 3:20-21, so was God's dealing with the temporal seed of Abraham, a type that is an acted prophecy of what befalls his spiritual descendants. Thus does the whole promise of Abraham belong to the church of Christ, for it was limited from the first to one of the nations of which Abraham was the natural parent, namely to that nation of Israel, of which now that men are elected, not by birth but by baptism, Romans 9:24, the church of Christ has inherited the privileges and the name, Galatians 3:16. The promise, says St. Paul, was not made to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, the church of Christ, 10 Ibid, whatever that's supposed to be, that the blessing of Abraham might come on the Gentile church, Galatians 3:14. The promise then that it should be the heir of the world, or head or chief, that Romans 4:13. The promise then that it should be the heir of the world, and that it should reduce the miseries which sin had introduced, was thus early given to the church of God, and for her sake and for the fulfillment of God's blessing have the long line of her patriarchs, saints and martyrs contended. Of these Abraham was among the greatest. He left his native land and went out, not knowing whither he went, or where he was going. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, the land of Canaan, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. So they were heads of chiefs that it was promised to, whose builder and maker is God. Hebrews 11:9-11. Here he afforded a memorable instance of domestic piety, setting up an altar to his God in every place of his temporary abode, and to reward his faith he had an especial vision of his great descendant, whose coming it was the privilege of the latter days to witness. But Abraham desired to see that day, and he saw it and was glad. He probably saw it through a vision. He didn't actually live that long to actually see this particular descendant living, walking, talking in his birthplace and the places he frequented, i.e. Jesus the Christ. Chapter 5. History of Egypt. Origin of its inhabitants. Sesostris, Pyramids, Necho. I must dwell longer upon Egypt because it contains more that is remarkable and more objects worthy of attention than any other country, with a peculiar climate and a river resembling no other in the world. The Egyptians have also laws and customs quite contrary to those of any other mortals. Herodotus 2:35. The Assyrian Empire had little to fear from the worldly might of Abraham, although in defence of his nephew Lot, he once defeated its prince, as though in token of the ultimate superiority of his children. It was different with the kingdom of Egypt, which for many centuries threatened to divide with it the command of the East, and was not finally conquered till the time of the Persians. Nor is this the only thing which renders the history of Egypt interesting. Painting, statuary, architecture, the art of medicine, and of what is called statistics, the art that is, by which the inhabitants and the wealth of states is calculated, had their origin in their country. Herodotus 2:177. The fables which passed from ancient Egypt into Greece have exercised great influence on literature. Thus we still retain in our language the word phoenix, a name derived from the early legend that every 500 years the bird as called came to the temple of the sun at Egyptian Thebes, that there a spontaneous fire consumed it, and that out of its ashes arose another bird to inherit its name and nature. Id 273. Further, Egypt was for many years the nursery of the Israelitish race. They were there as slaves, right, being oppressed. During the infancy of that people, God was pleased to let them grow up under the shelter of Egyptian civilization till they were numerous enough to be planted as a separate nation among the families of the earth. On all these accounts, the history of Egypt requires a place in any connected view of the progress of mankind, for it is not merely the extent of any country which makes it important, nor yet the number of its inhabitants, but that it should have been chosen by God to be an important link in the mighty chain by which he has bound together the first origin of men and their final destiny. That Egypt was one of the first countries settled after the flood, we gather from its being sometimes called the land of Ham, or Gam, the Kemites. Psalms 73, 51. Not too sure what that is. We're not too familiar with the Roman numerals. Haven't studied them long enough. It's something we should do. On all accounts, the history of Egypt requires a place in any connected view of the progress of mankind, for it is not merely the extent of any country which makes it important, nor yet the number of its inhabitants, but that it should have been chosen by God to be an important link in the mighty chain by which he has bound together the first origin of men and their final destiny. That Egypt was one of the first countries settled after the flood, we gather from its being sometimes called the land of Ham, and from its retaining in its native dialect a name derived from Ham's son, Mizraim. This early settlement before the tribes of men were widely separated was the reason probably why the Egyptians had so much in common with the Indians, or those of India, who are not supposed to have been the children of Ham, or not supposed to have been the children of Ham. Among both, for example, prevailed what were called castes, that is to say, a man might not pass from one rank or class to another, but children were obliged to follow the occupation of their parents. The ancient Egyptian language, there's a footnote down the bottom here. Thus, in the Semitic language, the pronoun he is the copula. In the Japhetic, the verb substantive is. But in this Coptic, the pronoun and verb substantive are employed indiscriminately. The ancient Egyptian language also was, in some curious particulars, a common link between that which was spoken by the descendants of Shem and Japheth. No doubt men must have been attracted to the country by the extreme fertility which is derived from the river Nile. The annual inundation of that river in the summer months, in consequence of the rains in Nubia, near its source, supplies Egypt, where it scarcely ever rains, with water. The lower and more fertile parts of the country, called from its shape the delta, the Greek name of the letter, looks like a triangle, is perfectly flat, and the villages are built on embankments, which during the inundation are left as islands amid the waves. Parts which the river cannot reach require to be watered artificially. Hence, Egypt is said to be watered by the foot. Deuteronomy 11:10. That is by water raised by foot pumps, or perhaps merely by men's labour. Whence the unusual alarm created by those storms with which Moses was ordered to afflict it. Exodus 10:24. Besides the fertility which it occasioned, the inundation of the river encouraged the growth of science in Egypt, because geometry, or a knowledge of the properties of figures, was required for dividing the land which the waters had covered. Herodotus 2:109. At an early period of their history, the Egyptians were enslaved by a foreign tribe, probably either the Assyrians or some people from the same quarter, who from their occupation were called Hyksos, or shepherds. Is that Hosea and Apion 1 as a footnote? This must have happened soon after the time of Abraham, for when his grandson Jacob was compelled by famine to remove from Canaan into Egypt, around BC 1706, great prejudice was felt against the occupation of his family. Every shepherd was an abomination to the Egyptians. Genesis 40? 684. The shepherd kings therefore had been driven out, but were still remembered. When Jacob's family first settled in Egypt, it was in number but 70 persons, but after remaining 216 years in that country, it had increased into a vast multitude. Ibid 27. At that time there rose up a king of a new family who was ignorant of the services which had been rendered to Egypt by Joseph. This new Pharaoh, so the kings of Egypt were called, from a word which signifies the sun. Wilkinson's Ancient Egypt, Chapter 2, was guilty of those great cruelties towards Israel which God punished by the infliction of 10 plagues. BC 1491. At first he subjected them to excessive labour in preparing bricks for his treasure cities and other public buildings, and more ancient bricks have been found to bear his mark than that of any other king of Egypt. 15 Ibid, Chapter 299. But as this did not check their increase, he put their children to death until God was pleased by a stretched out arm to bring them up out of the house of bondage. Though this for a time weakened the Egyptians, yet they recovered their strength, and being more skillful than their neighbours in the arts of war as well as those of peace, they continued to rule over the adjoining nations. During the time that the Israelites were governed by judges, the celebrated king Sesostris marched as far as into Asia, set up columns there in memory of his victories, and founded a colony of Colchis. Herodotus 2:102. Out of pride, he made the captive kings whom he had conquered draw his chariot. This was hardly a greater mark of ostentation than was shown by other Egyptian kings, who reared as their monuments those great pyramids, which continue to this day. The principal pyramids are 3 in number, the largest, which is attributed by Herodotus to Cheops, is 461 feet in height, about a third higher than St. Paul's, while its base, a square of 746 feet, is as large as the area of Lincoln's Inn Fields. Herodotus tells us that 100,000 men were engaged for 20 years in its erection. 17 Herodotus 2:124. The next in size were built by the successors of Cheops, his brother Cheophris, maybe that's Cheophris, and Mycerinus his son. Small chambers are found in the very centre of these buildings, accessible by narrow passages which were designed apparently for the burial place of the founders. It was a common custom of the Egyptians to preserve the bodies of their dead in figured cloths, of which vast numbers, as well as of the pictures which adorn their tombs, are still to be seen. The pictures form a sort of writing which, from their being employed to describe sacred subjects, are called hieroglyphics. In them we see many things which are mentioned in the Old Testament. God, having been pleased that the country where his people sojourned should be the longest remembered. We see the custom of embalming the dead, as was done with Jacob, and we find a separate class of men employed as physicians, as is mentioned in the book of Genesis. The worship of the golden calf is seen to be an imitation of what the Israelites had witnessed in Egypt. These and similar things are perpetuated by Egyptian monuments. Though this country commanded the entrance of the Nile, the largest river in the Old World, and adjoining both the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, was well adapted for purposes of commerce, yet owing to the exclusive disposition of its inhabitants, it was little known by the Greeks till the reign of Psammetichus. Herodotus 1152 BC 660. He owed his throne to the assistance of Grecian mercenaries, to whom in return he gave a settlement in Egypt. His son Necho, a warlike prince, extended the Egyptian power in Asia and captured Jerusalem after defeating King Hosea. Herodotus 159 BC 608. Herodotus calls it Kedetus, or the Holy City, and describes it as nearly of the size of Sardis. Herodotus 3:5. Necho, however, was compelled to yield to the arms of the Assyrians and to confine himself to his own continent. Jeremiah 60. Maybe. It's in Jeremiah. BC 604. Necho, however, was compelled to yield to the son of the Assyrians and to confine himself to his own continent. Here he had been engaged in constructing a canal which was to unite the river Nile to the Red Sea, an enterprise in which 120,000 persons are said to have perished. That's the Suez Canal. They were recreating it in that period of time, in that era. But he left his purpose incomplete, probably because on his defeat by the Assyrians he feared to facilitate their passage into Egypt. He continued, however, to direct his attention to the navigation of the Red Sea, and from the measures which he employed for discovering the south of Africa, he appears to have formed designs of extending his power in that direction. For it was by his orders that some Phoenician mariners sailed down the Red Sea with a view of discovering whether a passage could be found by it to the Straits of Gibraltar. The course which they held was one in which the winds were likely to favour them, and we are told that in every 3 years they passed around Africa, landing every winter and setting forth again at the approach of spring. A circumstance is added which, to the ancients, unacquainted with the southern hemisphere, threw doubt upon their testimony, but which is in reality the strongest confirmation of the truth of their narrative. They stated as a singular phenomenon what must necessarily happen to the south of the line, that as they sailed around Africa, the sun at midday appeared to the north and not to the south of them. That looks like them, we're not really sure. Africa, the sun at midday appeared to the north and not to the south of the sun. Maybe that's what it means. It's got here THUN. It doesn't look right, so I think it's a misprint or something. And that's what it's saying. The sun at midday appeared to the north and not to the south of the sun.